On a March morning in 1953, a woman walked into a courtroom in Manhattan and did something no wife of an American mafia boss had ever done before her. She sat down, raised her right hand, and told the truth in public, under oath, about exactly where her husband's money came from and exactly where it went. Reporters filled the benches behind her. A judge who had heard every kind of testimony New York's court system could produce leaned forward, because even he had never seen this particular kind of witness before. Her name was Anna Genovese. The man she had been married to for 2 decades was Vito Genovese, a man who would spend the rest of that decade clawing his way to the top of the American underworld through murder, betrayal, and raw terror, and who would eventually give his name to one of the 5 families that still define how most people picture the American Mafia. Only a couple of years earlier, millions of Americans had sat in front of their brand new television sets and watched a Senate committee grill mob figures about exactly this kind of money for the first time in the nation's history. Organized crime had gone, almost overnight, from something whispered about in Italian-American neighborhoods to something the entire country was suddenly hungry to understand. Anna Genovese walked into her courtroom in 1953, inside that exact atmosphere, and what she said did not stay contained to a divorce file. It became part of the public record of how American organized crime actually worked, at a moment when the public had never wanted that information more. Everyone who has ever watched a documentary about organized crime knows the name Vito Genovese. Almost nobody asks what it actually cost to be married to him. Almost nobody asks about the woman who, for one afternoon in a Manhattan courtroom, broke a silence that had protected men exactly like him for decades. This channel tells the stories the mob movies skip past, the wives and daughters standing just outside the frame while their husbands and fathers make history and then pay for it in blood. If that is your kind of story, hit subscribe now, because what happened to Anna, both before and after that courtroom testimony, is stranger, sadder, and more consequential than anything a screenwriter would dare to invent. Here is what almost nobody knows going in. Anna was not Vito's first wife. She was his second, and the timeline connecting wife number 1 to wife number 2 is short enough that it has followed Vito Genovese through every book, documentary, and courtroom transcript written about him since. His first wife, a woman named Donata, died of heart disease in 1931, at least according to the death certificate. Rumors that trailed Vito for the rest of his life told a different story, one involving poison and extremely convenient timing, though nobody ever proved it, and nobody ever will. Roughly a year later, Anna's own husband, a man named Gerard Vernautico, was found dead, under circumstances murky enough to raise eyebrows, even by the standards of 1930s New York. 11 days after that, Anna married Vito Genovese. 2 deaths, 2 marriages, a single year separating all 4 events. Draw your own conclusions. The New York Police Department in 1932 mostly declined to. That is not even the strangest part of Anna's story. She would go on to run her own nightclub in Greenwich Village, a business Vito purchased and put in her name, the kind of arrangement that let a mob boss's wife hold money and independence that almost no wife of that era, in that world, was ever permitted to have. That nightclub would become known, in the years that followed, for a clientele and an atmosphere that had almost nothing to do with her husband's business, and everything to do with a private life Anna built quietly for herself, away from him. She would become the subject of tabloid speculation about that private life, speculation that had little interest in her marriage, and a great deal of interest in who she spent her evenings with when Vito was elsewhere, which by most accounts was often. She would spend 2 decades absorbing the specific, grinding cost of being married to one of the most feared men in New York, his temper, his other women, his years-long disappearance to another continent while a murder charge hung over his head, his complete indifference to whether she survived any of it emotionally intact. And then, in 1952, At an age when most women of her background and generation had long since resigned themselves to whatever marriage they had made, Anna would do the one thing nobody expected from a woman married that deep into that world. She would walk away, and she would talk. What she said in that courtroom did not just end a marriage. It humiliated a man who could not survive being humiliated, inside a subculture built entirely on a single unbending rule. Later investigators would give that rule a name the whole country eventually learned: omerta, the code of absolute silence that governed everyone connected to organized crime, from the men who pulled triggers down to the wives who were expected to know nothing, ask nothing, and say nothing for as long as they lived. The assumption baked into that code was that women married into families like the Genoveses either genuinely did not know what their husbands did for a living, or knew everything and would carry it quietly to the grave without ever once saying it out loud to anyone outside the family. Anna broke that assumption completely, and she did it during a decade when the American public was more primed than it had ever been to actually listen to what she had to say. That silence was not just a social expectation. It was enforced, in ways both subtle and not, by the constant awareness that someone might always be listening. By the time federal investigators had built enough interest in Vito Genovese to start watching him seriously, the household Anna had spent years running was already the kind of place where you assumed the phone might be tapped, and a car parked too long down the block might not be there by accident. That was the atmosphere Anna lived inside for the better part of 2 decades, long before she ever sat down in front of a judge. Fear that was constant enough to become background noise, and a husband who treated that fear as simply part of the furniture. Some people who have studied the Genovese family closely believe that testimony started a chain of consequences that followed Vito for the rest of his life, all the way to a federal narcotics conviction 7 years later that struck many observers of the era as suspicious in its own right, and all the way to the prison cell in the American Midwest, where he eventually died. Nobody can prove the line runs that cleanly from a 1953 courtroom to a 1969 death certificate, but the men who ran in those circles at the time believed it mattered enormously. And Anna Genovese lived out the rest of her own life carrying the knowledge of exactly what she had done, and what it might have quietly cost the man she had once married, for reasons that had very little to do with love and everything to do with survival. This is the story of how she got there and what it actually looked like, from the inside, to be married to Vito Genovese. Her story, as much of it as survives in any reliable form, starts in New York City in the early 1900s, inside the world of working-class Italian immigrant families packed into the tenements of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. Detailed records of Anna's exact childhood did not survive the way records of wealthier families tend to survive, and most of what can be reconstructed about her comes from the years after her name started appearing in court files and newspaper columns. What is known is that by the time she reached adulthood, she had already married once, to a man named Gerard Vernotico, and that this first marriage put her, however briefly, into an ordinary working life, far removed from anything resembling the underworld that would come to define the rest of her years. It is worth pausing on that ordinary life for a moment, precisely because so little of Anna's story allows for it afterward. Whatever her circumstances as a young, working-class woman in 1920s New York, marrying Gerard Vernotico did not connect her to organized crime, to hidden money, or to any of the danger that would eventually define her name in every account written about her since. She was, by every indication, simply a young woman starting an ordinary marriage in an ordinary immigrant neighborhood, with no reason to expect that her second marriage would look anything like her first, or that her name would still be studied by true crime writers and organized crime historians nearly a century later. Vito Genovese, meanwhile, had already built the beginning of a criminal resume that would eventually make him one of the most powerful and most feared men in the history of American organized crime. Born in Italy in 1897, he immigrated to New York as a teenager and worked his way up through Prohibition-era bootlegging, extortion, and increasingly serious violence under the tutelage of Charles Luciano, the man who would go on to essentially invent the modern American Mafia as a structured, business-like criminal organization rather than a loose collection of feuding neighborhood gangs. By the early 1930s, Vito was Luciano's most trusted and most dangerous lieutenant, a man other men in that world were already careful around. He was also, by every account that survives, already married to Vito Genovese, a woman about whom very little is recorded except the manner and timing of her death. Vito died in 1931. The official cause was heart disease. The rumor that has followed Vito Genovese through 8 decades of true crime writing is that the heart disease had help, that Vito wanted her gone and made certain of it. Nobody has ever proven this, and it is worth being honest about that uncertainty rather than presenting a rumor as settled fact. What can be documented is the timeline that follows, and the timeline is uncomfortable enough on its own without needing the rumor to do the work. Anna's first husband, Gerard Vernatico, died in 1932. The circumstances were murky enough that they drew attention, even at the time, though not enough to produce an investigation that went anywhere meaningful. 11 days after Vernatico's death, Anna married Vito Genovese. Sit with that for a second. 11 days. There is no surviving direct evidence that Vito had anything to do with Vernatico's death, just as there is no surviving direct evidence connecting him to Donata's. What exists is a pattern. 2 inconvenient spouses removed within roughly a year of each other, followed by a marriage that gave Vito a young second wife, and gave Anna a life inside more money and more danger than she likely could have previously imagined for herself. Whether Anna knew, suspected, or simply chose not to ask, is one of the questions her story never fully answers, and it is a question worth taking seriously, rather than assuming an easy answer either way. What is certain is that she said yes, and that the decision to say yes shaped the next 37 years of her life, for better and considerably for worse. The 1930s, and into the 1940s, were, from the outside, the good years. Vito's power inside the Luciano organization kept growing as prohibition gave way to a new and more diversified criminal economy built on numbers running, loan sharking, and the extortion of legitimate businesses that had no real choice but to pay whatever protection they were told to pay. Anna lived the version of wealth that came with that power. Apartments, clothes, and eventually her own nightclub in Greenwich Village, purchased for her by Vito and run under her own name, at a moment in the neighborhood's history when Greenwich Village was already known as one of the few corners of New York where people who did not fit the era's rigid expectations could find something resembling a community. For a woman of Anna's background, in that decade, owning and running that kind of business was a level of independence that few wives, gangster or otherwise, ever got to hold, and it set her apart sharply from the traditional expectation placed on Italian-American wives of that generation, that a wife stayed home, raised children, and never appeared in public in any capacity that drew attention to herself. Anna drew attention constantly, by choice, running a business with her own name on the door. It came at a price that would only become fully visible much later. Vito was not a faithful husband, by every account that survives. He was not, by the recollections of people who knew the family, a particularly kind one either. And the business that funded the nightclub and the apartments was built on a foundation of violence that eventually touches everyone standing close enough to it, whether or not they ever pick up a weapon themselves. There is no surviving account of Vito Genovese as a warm or attentive husband in any conventional sense of either word. What survives instead are the shapes his absence and his temper left behind. A wife who built a life largely apart from him inside the same marriage, associates who learned early to read his mood before speaking, and a household where affection, when it existed at all, competed constantly with fear. None of that made Anna unique among women married into that world. It is simply the specific version of it that happened to eventually become part of the public record, because she made sure it did. In 1937, that violence caught up with Vito directly. He was indicted for the 1934 murder of a small-time hood named Ferdinand Boccia, and rather than stand trial in New York, he fled to Italy, where he spent the better part of a decade cultivating relationships inside Mussolini's fascist government, while continuing to direct rackets back home from across an ocean. By some accounts, he made himself useful enough to fascist officials, and generous enough with the money he brought with him, that he was treated less like a fugitive and more like a valued guest of the regime for much of that decade. A level of comfort most men fleeing a murder charge do not get to enjoy. Anna did not go with him. She stayed in New York, running the nightclub, managing a marriage that existed mostly on paper, and across a war that was actively being fought on the very continent her husband had chosen to hide on. She absorbed a version of abandonment that most wives of her era were never expected to discuss out loud, let alone in a courtroom, and she absorbed it for nearly 8 years, with no clear promise that Vito would ever come home at all, let alone come home a free man. Vito came home in 1945, delivered back into American custody by occupying forces after the collapse of the fascist government he had spent years cultivating. The murder case against him fell apart almost immediately when the key witness died of poisoning while supposedly under the protection of the state, an outcome that surprised almost nobody who understood how Vito Genovese solved problems that stood in his way. He walked free. He picked up more or less where he had left off, rebuilding his position inside an organization that had, in his absence, effectively become Frank Costello's, with Vito circling it the entire time, patient, resentful, and clearly waiting for an opening that he intended to make for himself if one did not appear on its own. Before we get to the part of this story that ended up in every New York newspaper, if you have made it this far, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. What happens next is the reason Anna Genovese's name still comes up in serious histories of the American Mafia, more than 70 years after she said what she said in that courtroom. By the early 1950s, Anna had lived inside this marriage for close to 2 decades. She had watched Vito consolidate power through fear and murder, while she raised what stability she could inside a household that was never actually stable. She had absorbed his infidelities, his temper, and the specific, corrosive uncertainty of being married to a man capable of ordering someone's death over breakfast and returning to the table calm enough to finish his coffee. She had built her own small sphere of independence around the nightclub, and by several accounts from the period, she had also built a private life of her own away from Vito, one that reportedly included relationships with women, a detail that became part of the public record once the marriage began to collapse and the tabloids got hold of it. Whatever comfort or honesty Anna found in that private life, she found it inside a marriage that offered her almost none of either. The country around her had also changed. The televised Senate hearings of 1950 and 1951 had already put organized crime figures in front of the American public in a way that had never happened before, and newspapers across the country had developed a genuine appetite for stories that pulled back the curtain on how men like Vito Genovese actually lived and actually earned. Anna's separation hearing did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the middle of a national mood that was already leaning in, already curious, already primed to treat exactly the kind of financial detail she was about to provide as front-page material rather than a private family matter buried in a Kings County file cabinet. In 1952, Anna filed for a legal separation. What followed was not a quiet, private dissolution handled by lawyers behind closed doors, the kind of ending most mafia marriages of that era were expected to have, and almost always did have. It became a public hearing, and Anna, called to testify about the couple's finances and living arrangements, did something almost nobody in her position had ever done before her. She talked. She described Vito's income from illegal gambling operations in detail that went far beyond anything he had ever reported to the government in his life. She described hidden money, hidden arrangements, and a lifestyle built entirely on criminal proceeds that Vito Genovese had spent 2 decades trying to keep out of any official record whatsoever. Reporters covering the hearing understood immediately what they were watching. A mafia boss's own wife was handing law enforcement and the reading public a detailed picture of exactly how organized crime money moved through New York, and she was doing it under oath, on the record, with her own name attached to every single word of it. The story did not stay confined to the legal notices. Within days, it had moved from the back pages reserved for routine divorce filings to the front sections where organized crime coverage lived, and it stayed there for weeks. Columnists who had spent years writing around the edges of what men like Vito Genovese actually did for a living suddenly had a primary source willing to put numbers and specifics on the record. For Anna, there was no undoing that once it happened. Whatever protection her marriage had once offered her, and whatever protection staying quiet might have continued to offer, was gone the moment the transcript became public. The underworld Vito operated and ran on that same code mentioned earlier, the unwritten rule that the business stayed inside the business, that wives and children and outsiders never spoke about what they knew, no matter what they had witnessed or suffered because of it. Anna broke that code completely, in open court, in front of reporters, in a way that could not be walked back, softened, or explained away later. For a man whose entire authority rested on being feared and respected in equal measure, having his own wife expose him like that was not simply embarrassing. It was, in the specific logic of that world, dangerous. It told every other man in the organization that Vito Genovese could not even control the person standing closest to him, the one person who was supposed to know everything and say nothing. The years that followed did not go especially well for Vito, and it is difficult to know for certain how much of that was direct consequence and how much was simple coincidence. He spent the rest of the 1950s clawing toward full control of what would eventually be called the Genovese crime family, a campaign that included orchestrating the attempted murder of Frank Costello in 1957 and, later that same year, the actual murder of Albert Anastasia, shot dead in a barber's chair, in a killing that remains one of the most famous mafia hits in American history. A few weeks after that, dozens of organized crime figures from across the country gathered at a house in the small town of Appalachian, New York, a summit that was supposed to confirm Vito's new position at the top of his world, and instead turned into a public relations disaster when local police stumbled onto the meeting and sent the country's most powerful gangsters scattering through the woods in expensive suits, photographed and identified for the first time on a scale the public had never seen. Vito got what he wanted. He became boss. He did not get to enjoy the position for long, and the version of the underworld he had spent 30 years learning to survive in was, by the time he finally reached the top of it, already changing into something far more exposed than it had ever been before. Partly because of men like Joseph Valachi, who would later testify openly about the organization's inner workings, and partly, some have argued, because his own wife had already shown the country that the wall of silence protecting men like him was not as solid as it had always claimed to be. In 1959, Vito Genovese was convicted on federal narcotics trafficking charges, largely on the testimony of a small-time drug dealer named Nelson Cantellops, a man with no obvious personal reason to possess the kind of detailed knowledge his testimony contained. The conviction sent Vito to federal prison for 15 years. For decades afterward, organized crime historians and chroniclers of that era have floated a theory that has never been proven, and probably never will be, that rival bosses, including men Vito had betrayed or humiliated on his own climb to power, engineered the narcotics case specifically to remove him, using Cantellops as a paid or coerced witness against a man too dangerous to challenge any other way. Whether Anna's courtroom testimony years earlier fed directly into that theory, or simply added to a broader sense that Vito Genovese had become too exposed, too talked about, too visible to men who valued invisibility above almost everything else in their lives, is something the historical record does not settle cleanly. What is not in dispute is that Vito Genovese, a man who spent his entire adult life making absolutely certain that nobody outside his own organization ever knew what he was worth or how he actually made his money, had his own wife say it out loud in a courtroom 7 years before the government finally managed to put him away for good. Vito died in prison in 1969 of a heart attack at the Federal Medical Facility in Springfield, Missouri. He was 71 years old. He had spent roughly a decade of his final years behind bars, still legally married, at least on paper, to the woman who had once described his finances to a judge in more detail than his own accountants ever managed to. Anna's life after that becomes much harder to track in reliable detail, and honestly, that gap is its own kind of statement. Vito Genovese has an extensive historical record: court documents, FBI files, newspaper archives, entire books devoted to reconstructing his life, move by move, year by year, murder by murder. Anna has fragments: a separation filing, a courtroom transcript that still gets cited in histories of American organized crime, tabloid coverage of a private life she was not supposed to have and chose to have anyway, and then, mostly, silence, the specific kind of silence that swallows women whose only documented significance to most historians is who they happen to marry. Every few years, some new book or documentary about the Genovese crime family reaches back into that 1953 transcript, pulls out a line or two about hidden money and unreported income, and moves on to whatever happened to Vito next. Anna's name gets a mention. Her testimony gets a sentence, maybe two. The woman who sat in that courtroom and actually said the words rarely gets more than that, even now, even in accounts specifically built around exposing the men she once helped expose. That silence is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something true about how these stories usually get told. Vito Genovese gets books, documentaries, entire chapters in the history of American organized crime. Anna gets a paragraph, usually framed as a footnote to his story rather than the center of her own, mentioned mainly for the one afternoon she made his life harder. But she was the one person inside that marriage who, for one specific afternoon in 1953, refused to play the part the world had assigned her. She did not stay silent to protect a man who had never once protected her. She did not disappear quietly into the background of somebody else's legend, the way the wives of men like Vito Genovese were expected to do for the rest of their lives. She stood up, under oath, in a courtroom full of reporters, and told the truth about a man that almost nobody else alive was willing or able to tell. It did not make her famous. It did not make her safe. It may not have even been the reason things eventually caught up with Vito Genovese, though plenty of people who lived through that era believed it was. What it did was give her, for one recorded moment in a life that history mostly declined to document, a voice loud enough that it is still being written about more than 70 years later. That is not nothing. For a woman married into a world built specifically to make sure women like her never had one, it might be the single most important thing she ever did with the years she was given. It is tempting, looking back from this distance, to want a cleaner ending for her, a clear consequence that followed directly from her courage, a moment where the story rewards her for what it cost her to tell the truth. History rarely obliges that kind of tidiness. Anna Genovese did not become a folk hero. She did not get a book deal or a movie, or even a full obituary that most people ever read. She got a transcript, a handful of newspaper clippings, and the specific, complicated satisfaction of knowing she had told the truth about a man who had spent his entire life making sure the truth about him never surfaced anywhere official. Some victories look exactly that small from the outside and still matter enormously to the person who won them. There is a version of this story that ends with Anna Genovese as a victim and nothing more. A woman who married into money and violence and paid for both. That version is not wrong, exactly. It is just incomplete. She married a dangerous man 11 days after burying the last one, and whatever mixture of fear, ambition, and calculation went into that decision, she spent the following 2 decades finding whatever scraps of independence and honesty she could inside a life that was never designed to allow her either. And then, when the marriage finally broke, she chose to leave a record behind instead of walking away quietly. Most women in her exact position never got that choice, or never took it. Anna did. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones that live in the shadow of more famous names and deserve better than a footnote, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments who you want us to cover next. Anna Genovese spent 2 decades in silence and 1 afternoon breaking it. Somebody should remember that. Thanks for watching.